The German pilot had the crippled bomber dead in his sights. One short burst, and it was his. It would be his 30th kill, and his 30th kill would earn him the highest honor his country could give a fighter pilot. He had already shot down 2 American bombers that morning. This third one could barely fly. Its guns were silent, its engines were failing, and through the holes torn in its side he could see men bleeding inside it. He did not fire. Instead, on the 20th of December 1943, in the freezing sky over Germany, Franz Stigler made a decision that could have had him shot by his own side, and it kept 10 Americans alive. The bomber was an American B-17 Flying Fortress with a joking name painted on its nose, Olde Pub. That morning it had been part of a great stream of bombers heading for the German city of Bremen. Now it was alone, a wreck limping across the sky, carrying a dead man and a crew of wounded boys who did not expect to live another hour. The story of what happened between that bomber and that fighter would be buried by both sides for almost 50 years. When it finally came out, it became one of the most remarkable things any airman on either side did in the whole war. To understand how these two men met in that freezing sky, you have to understand what daylight bombing over Germany actually was in the winter of 1943. The American 8th Air Force flew its heavy bombers deep into Germany in broad daylight, without enough fighter escort to see them all the way to the target and back. German flak guns waited in their hundreds. German fighters waited beyond them. The bomber crews flew in tight boxes for mutual protection, and they had a grim nickname for the exposed outer edge of the formation, where a green crew was most likely to be picked off. They called it Purple Heart Corner. The pilot of Olde Pub was a 21-year-old old farm boy from Western West Virginia named Charlie Brown. December 20th was his first combat mission and the first mission for almost all of his crew. 10 young men, most of them barely out of their teens, climbing into a brand new bomber to fly into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. They had been warned in the briefing that they might meet hundreds of German fighters and that the target was ringed by more than 250 flak guns. Then someone else's engine trouble moved them up toward the front of the formation, and they took off into a bitter, cloudless morning. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like and stay with us all the way to the end. But before the guns, it's worth knowing who these men were, on both sides, because that is what makes what happened make sense. Charlie Brown had grown up on a farm, loved airplanes as a boy, and joined the army before Pearl Harbor. His crew called themselves the Quiet Ones, disciplined, green, and loyal to one another. On the other side of the front was Franz Stigler, a Bavarian who had flown as an airline pilot before the war and had lost his own brother to it. He was, by December 1943, an experienced ace with 27 victories, and he had been taught something by a commander that he had never forgotten. The commander's name was Gustav Rödel, and Stigler had served under him in the fighting over North Africa. Rödel had a rule he drove into his young pilots: "You are fighter pilots first," he told them, and if he ever saw or heard of one of them shooting at a man in a parachute, he would shoot that pilot himself. It was a line about honor in a war that had very little of it, and Stigler carried it with him. He did not yet know that a year later, in a freezing sky over his own country, that rule would be tested in a way Rödel had never imagined. Over Bremen, the flak found Olde Pub first. Just as the bomber began its run toward the target, the sky around it filled with black bursts. Shrapnel shattered the bomber's plexiglass nose, knocked out one engine completely, and damaged another. Even hurt, the crew held their course and dropped their bombs on the target. But a B-17 with 2 engines gone could not keep up with the formation. Slowly, helplessly, Olde Pub fell back and out of the protective box, a lone straggler in a sky that punished stragglers without mercy. What was waiting was a pack of German fighters. More than a dozen Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs fell on the crippled bomber and tore into it from every angle. For long minutes the crew of Olde Pub fought them off with what guns they had, but the cold and the damage were beating them as badly as the enemy. Guns froze and jammed, men were hit. By the time the fighters finally broke off, the bomber was a flying wreck, and the men inside it were in a desperate fight simply to keep it in the air. The cost inside the aircraft was terrible. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, had been killed at his post. Others were badly wounded, one hit in the leg, one in the eye, another's feet freezing in the wind that howled through the broken airframe. Brown himself had been hit in the shoulder. The morphine had frozen solid in the sub-zero cold, so the men could barely ease each other's pain. Then the thin oxygen and the damage overwhelmed Brown, and he blacked out at the controls. When he came to, the bomber had fallen thousands of feet and was skimming just above the German countryside. Down on a German airfield, a fighter ace was refueling and rearming when a shadow passed low overhead. Franz Stigler looked up and saw it, an American bomber, so shot up it seemed impossible it was still flying, staggering along barely above the trees. To a fighter pilot won victory from the Knight's Cross, it was almost a gift. He put out his cigarette, climbed into his Messerschmitt, and took off after it. In seconds he had caught the wounded fortress and slid in behind it, lined up for the kill. His thumb was near the trigger, and then he looked, really looked, at what was in front of him. Through the great holes torn in the bomber's skin, Stigler could see straight inside it. He saw the crew, some slumped and wounded, others working frantically to help the men who were hurt. He saw a tail gun that never moved, its gunner dead behind it. This was not a fighting aircraft anymore. It was a flying ambulance full of injured boys who could not shoot back, and in that moment Rodel's words came back to him. To me, Stigler said years later, it was just like they were in a parachute. I saw them, and I couldn't shoot them down. What he did next was almost stranger than holding his fire. Stigler flew up alongside the bomber, so close that the exhausted Americans could see his face in the cockpit. Charlie Brown could not believe it, a German fighter, flying formation on his wing, not shooting. Stigler was trying to tell him something. He gestured again and again toward the ground, then toward the northeast, trying to get Brown to land and be taken prisoner, or to turn for neutral Sweden, where his wounded could be treated and the crew would sit out the war alive. Brown, half frozen and disbelieving, did not understand and kept flying west toward England. Stigler had a choice to make, and every version of it was dangerous. He could turn back and let the bomber fly on toward the coast, where German anti-aircraft guns would almost certainly finish it. Or he could do something that, if anyone saw it, could end with him in front of a firing squad for treason. He chose the second. He tucked his Messerschmitt in tight beside the American bomber and stayed there, so that the gunners on the ground, seeing a German fighter flying escort, would hold their fire and let both aircraft pass. What these two men did over the next few minutes is the heart of the story. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We're just getting to it. Because now an American bomber and a German fighter were flying side by side across occupied Europe toward the coast as if they were on the same side. The German flak batteries below saw one of their own fighters escorting the cripple and let it go by. Inside the bomber, the crew watched the enemy plane on their wing with a mixture of terror and wonder, not daring to believe what it seemed to mean. On the flight deck, Charlie Brown was still not sure this wasn't some trick, that the German wasn't simply waiting to shoot them down over the water, away from witnesses. As they neared the coast, Brown ordered one of his gunners to swing a turret around and point it at the Messerschmitt, not to fire, but to warn the German off, to say, "We see you, don't try anything." Stigler saw the guns turn toward him. He did not flinch and he did not fire. He had brought them as far as he safely could. Ahead lay the open grey water of the North Sea and the edge of German airspace. At the coast, with the bomber finally out over the sea and beyond the reach of the German guns, Stigler had done everything he could do. He looked across the small gap of freezing air at the American pilot he had just chosen not to kill. And then he saluted him. A crisp, deliberate salute from one airman to another, rolled his fighter away and was gone, back toward Germany and a secret he would have to keep for the rest of the war. Charlie Brown watched him go, and only slowly understood that the enemy had just escorted him out of the jaws of death. Now the sea itself was the enemy. Olde Pub had to cross roughly 250 miles of open, freezing water on failing engines, its crew wounded, its navigation shot away. Brown and his co-pilot nursed the shuddering bomber across the waves. Every mile a small miracle, the men in the back holding on and holding each other together. And somehow, impossibly, England rose out of the haze ahead. The battered fortress found an airfield and put down, the crew alive, save for the one man they had lost. They had flown a wreck home from the middle of Germany. On the ground in England, the crew told the truth at their debriefing. A German fighter had caught them, defenseless, and had chosen to let them go. The reaction was not what they expected. Their officers told them to say nothing about it to anyone. The encounter was classified. The reasoning was cold but not stupid. Command feared that if word spread that a German pilot had shown mercy, other American crews might hesitate at the wrong moment, might assume an enemy fighter meant no harm, and die for it. So the story was buried. As Brown put it years later, someone had decided you couldn't be human and be flying in a German cockpit. On the other side of the front, Franz Stigler kept his own silence, and his was far more dangerous. To have spared an enemy bomber, to have escorted it to safety, was treason in the eyes of the Nazi regime he flew for, punishable by death. He told his superiors nothing. He said later that he lost his taste for chasing the Knight's Cross after that day. The honor he had been 1 kill away from no longer meant what it had. He flew on to the end of the war, even flying one of the first jet fighters in its final months, and carried his secret out the other side of Germany's defeat. For both men, the war ended and life went on, but the day in the sky would not let either of them go. Stigler emigrated to Canada and built a new life, haunted by a question he could not answer. Had the bomber made it home? Had those wounded boys survived? He had risked everything for them and never learned whether it mattered. Charlie Brown finished his combat tour, served his country for decades more, and was haunted by the mirror image of that same question. Who was the German who had spared them, and why? Neither man had a name for the other, just a face and a salute and a debt that had no address. In the 1980s, Charlie Brown began to search. He dug through American and German records and found nothing that could name the man. At last, he wrote a short letter to a newsletter for former combat pilots, describing the encounter and asking a simple question. Who was the German who spared my life on the 20th of December 1943 north of Bremen? Far away in Canada, an old man opened his newsletter and read a description of the most important thing he had ever done. Franz Stigler sat down and wrote back 4 words that ended 40 years of not knowing. I was the one. In 1990, the two men met face to face for the first time since that freezing sky, the American bomber pilot and the German ace who had spared him. They were old men now. When they finally sat together, the wall of 47 years fell away in an instant. Stigler proved beyond doubt that he was the one. He could describe the whole encounter down to the salute. And the two enemies, who had met once for a few minutes with death between them, became, in the years that followed, the closest of friends, traveling together, telling their story, their families bound together by that single choice in the air. For the crew of Olde Pub, Stigler became something almost beyond words. One of the men Brown brought to meet him, a gunner who had lived because the bomber was spared, wept as he thanked the German for the life he had gone on to have, the children and grandchildren who existed because of a choice their enemy made. Stigler, who had lost his own brother in the war, once wrote to Brown that the American pilot he had spared was, to him, as precious as that lost brother had been. Two men on opposite sides of the deadliest war in history had somehow become family. In 2008, after 18 years of friendship, the two old pilots died within months of one another, Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown, gone in the same year, as if neither was meant to be long without the other. The one crewman they could not save, Tail Gunner Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, was 23 years old. He was the only man of the 10 who did not come home from Olde Pub's first mission, and he should be remembered by name. Years later, the surviving crew were awarded the medals their buried story had denied them. Charlie Brown received the Air Force Cross, and the whole account was finally set down in full by the historian Adam Makos in a book he called, After the Thing That Stayed Stigler's Hand, A Higher Call. 1 kill from the highest honor of his war, a fighter ace looked into a broken bomber, saw wounded men who could not fight back, and remembered that he was a human being before he was a soldier. He did not save an enemy that day. They saved each other right back. And 47 years later, they saved each other right back. People still debate what Franz Stigler did, whether it was courage or conscience or a private refusal to let one more good thing die in a terrible war. Maybe you have a view. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family flew or served in the 8th Air Force or in any part of the air war over Europe in any role, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did or said, or one thing you remember. The men of Olde Pub deserve more than a line in a database. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.